The dining room glowed with soft candlelight. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier above. Wine bottles sat chilling on the sideboard. Then Richard made his announcement. "I have someone special coming tonight," he said with a satisfied smirk toward the entrance. "My ex-wife, Victoria, the woman who couldn't understand real success." Everyone paused as Victoria walked through the doorway, but she wasn't alone. A tall man in an impeccably tailored Armani suit followed behind her, his hand gently touching her lower back. His Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist. He looked at her with absolute devotion. "Before I tell you what happened, I want to remind you to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it so that more people can see what happens when the universe has a sense of justice. Drop a comment below about where you're watching from. I want us to build an amazing community together. And trust me, you won't believe how this dinner ends. Now, everyone, I'd like you to meet my fiancé, Alexander Chen," Victoria announced, her voice confident and poised. The room fell silent. Richard had planned the perfect revenge, but it just became his greatest humiliation and a lesson he never expected to learn. "I want to invite Victoria to dinner," Richard Hammond said, scrolling through his phone with a calculated smile. "I want her to see everything she threw away." His business partner Derek looked up from his drink, eyebrows raised. "Victoria? Your ex? That's brutal, man." It was a cool Saturday evening in Manhattan. Richard sat in his penthouse apartment on the Upper West Side, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. He worked as a venture capitalist at Hammond & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious firms. On his glass coffee table sat a Rolex watch and a copy of his latest business success story in Forbes. "Why not?" Richard asked, leaning back in his Italian leather chair. "It's the perfect chance to show her what a real empire looks like." Derek shook his head. "It's been 4 years since your divorce. Why do you still need to prove something to her?" Richard stared at his reflection in the window. At 52, he'd built everything from nothing. 3 failed marriages, 2 successful exits, a net worth that most people could only dream about. "Victoria wanted me to slow down, to focus on family instead of business," Richard said coldly. "She couldn't handle my ambition. Now I'm at the top of my field, throwing the most exclusive dinner of the season. She should see what she couldn't support." After Derek left, Richard pulled up his contact list. He composed a personalized email invitation, choosing each word carefully. "Come see what real success looks like. I've built an empire since you left me. You should witness it." He smiled as he hit send. 1 week later in San Francisco, Victoria Chen reviewed the email at her standing desk in her corner office. Victoria Holdings occupied the entire 45th floor of a modern glass building in Soma. Her company specialized in sustainable technology investments, and her portfolio had generated over $2 billion in returns over the past 3 years. She recognized Richard's name immediately, though she barely thought about him anymore. The email was typical of him, aggressive, self-centered, designed to sting. But it only made her smile. "Interesting," she said aloud to her executive assistant, James. James looked at the screen. "Your ex-husband?" "Yes, he's throwing a dinner. He wants me to watch him succeed. Are you going?" Victoria sat back in her chair, thinking. She glanced at the photo on her desk. Her and Alexander at last month's benefit gala in Monaco. They'd met 2 years ago through a mutual venture, and he had become her partner in everything. He was the founder and CEO of Chen Technologies, a company valued at $47 billion. He understood her ambition because he shared it. "Actually, I think I will go," Victoria said. James's eyes widened. "Really?" "Richard spent 4 years telling me I wasn't enough," Victoria explained, "that my humanitarian goals were holding him back, that I was too soft for the business world." She pulled up her calendar on her computer screen. "After I left him, I realized I didn't need to change. I needed to find someone who appreciated who I already was. And Alexander does." Victoria nodded, looking at the photo again. "He does. Last week he asked me to marry him." James nearly dropped his tablet. "And?" I said yes. That evening, Richard stood in his penthouse, studying his reflection in the mirror. He adjusted his tie, Hermes silk naturally. His hair had begun graying at the temples, which he found distinguished. He thought about Victoria often, though he would never admit it. She had been his third wife, and their marriage had lasted 8 years. She'd been beautiful, intelligent, and successful in her own right. But she'd never truly understood him. She'd wanted him to invest in social enterprises, to think about legacy beyond money. She'd asked him to cut back on work, to travel, to simply be present. He'd told her she was naive, that the business world didn't reward sentiment or environmental causes. The day she left, she'd said something that had bothered him ever since. "I finally realized you don't want a partner. You want an audience." He'd dismissed it then. But since her departure, 3 relationships had failed. His son hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. His business, while successful, had begun to feel hollow. Still, Richard pushed the thought away. Tonight would remind her of what she'd lost. That was what mattered. The invitation he'd sent came with specific instructions. The dinner would be at Aurelius, a 3-Michelin-star restaurant where he had connections. It would showcase everything she'd rejected: wealth, power, influence, prestige. His phone buzzed. Victoria's confirmation had arrived. She would be there. 3 weeks later, Victoria prepared for the evening. She selected a floor-length emerald gown that had been custom-made for her in Milan. Her diamond engagement ring caught the light, a stunning 3-carat stone that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother. Alexander fastened his cufflinks in their bedroom. "You're sure about this?" he asked, studying her in the mirror. "I've never been more sure," Victoria replied. She turned to face him. "He needs to see that I didn't fail. I evolved." "You didn't fail at the marriage," Alexander said, pulling her close. "He failed to see what he had." They held each other for a moment, and Victoria felt the familiar sense of peace that being with Alexander always brought her. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They simply lived, worked, and loved with intention. The driver picked them up at 7 o'clock and took them to Manhattan. As they rode through the city, Victoria looked out at the glittering skyline. She thought about who she'd been 4 years ago, broken, questioning herself, wondering if Richard had been right about her being too soft for this world. She was glad that version of herself no longer existed. At Aurelius, Richard stood near the entrance checking his watch. He'd arrived early to ensure everything was perfect. His guests included his investors, his board members, his rivals, people whose respect he'd spent years cultivating. The private dining room was designed to impress. A carefully curated art collection hung on the walls. The table was set with Bernardot porcelain and Baccarat crystal. The wine selection featured bottles worth more than most people's monthly rent. His guests began arriving at 7:30. By 8 o'clock, the room was full of the city's most powerful people. Richard moved between conversations, accepting congratulations on his latest acquisition deal. Everything was going exactly as planned. At 8:15, the maitre d' appeared at the doorway. "Your next guest has arrived, Mr. Hammond." Richard's heart quickened. He positioned himself near the entrance, checking his reflection one final time in a nearby mirror. The doors opened. Victoria stepped through first, radiant in her emerald gown. For a moment, Richard forgot to breathe. She was more beautiful than he remembered, but it wasn't just her appearance. She carried herself differently than she had as his wife, with complete confidence, with authority, with peace. Then Alexander entered behind her. Richard felt his stomach drop. He recognized Alexander Chen immediately. How could he not? Chen Technologies was one of the most influential companies in the world. Alexander Chen's net worth was estimated at over $100 billion. He was featured regularly in business publications, known for his philanthropic ventures and his commitment to sustainable innovation. Richard had read articles about him, envied him, if he was being honest. Alexander's hand found the small of Victoria's back as they surveyed the room. The gesture was intimate, possessive, and completely natural. He looked at her like she was the most valuable thing in his world. "Richard," Victoria said, approaching him, "thank you for the invitation." Richard found his voice, though it sounded strained. "Victoria, you came." "I did," she said. "I wanted you to meet someone. Richard, this is Alexander Chen. Alexander, this is my ex-husband, Richard Hammond." Alexander extended his hand. His grip was firm, confident. His eyes assessed Richard with the cool calculation of someone accustomed to sizing up business competitors. "Victoria has spoken about you," Alexander said politely, though his tone suggested the conversation had not been particularly interesting. "Alexander is my fiancé," Victoria added. "We're getting married next spring in Amalfi." Richard felt the room tilt. Around them, he could see his guests recognizing Alexander. Conversations shifted. Eyes turned toward him with new interest, not in him, but in the man standing beside his ex-wife. "That's wonderful," Richard managed to say, though the words tasted like ash. Alexander smiled briefly and guided Victoria toward the dining area. "Shall we sit?" Victoria mentioned you'd planned quite an evening. As they moved past him, Richard caught himself staring. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Victoria was supposed to arrive alone, impressed by his success, perhaps regretful about their divorce. Instead, she'd arrived with someone even more successful, and she looked genuinely happy. The dinner proceeded with excruciating formality. Richard sat at the head of the table as planned, but Alexander ended up commanding the conversation. He spoke about Chen Technologies' latest investment in renewable energy. He discussed the future of sustainable enterprise with an eloquence that made Richard's own business accomplishments seem small and provincial. When Alexander mentioned that he and Victoria had just donated $50 million to establish scholarships for underprivileged students in technology fields, Richard watched several of his guests lean toward him with renewed interest. Victoria mentioned her venture fund's success, her role on several nonprofit boards, her upcoming book about building businesses with purpose. She spoke with pride about the 300 companies she'd invested in that were now focused on social impact. "Richard always told me humanitarian work wasn't serious business," Victoria said at one point, her tone not bitter, just factual. "I'm glad I didn't listen to him." Alexander reached over and squeezed her hand. The gesture was so naturally affectionate that Richard had to look away. His son Christopher was at the dinner. They'd reconciled enough for Richard to send him an invitation. Richard watched his son listening to Victoria and Alexander talk about education reform. Christopher was smiling in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. After dinner, Christopher asked Victoria for a hug, which she gave willingly. Then he shook Alexander's hand and told him he admired his work. By the evening's end, most of Richard's guests had spent more time talking to Alexander and Victoria than to Richard. When they left, several people asked for Alexander's contact information. One of Richard's board members even mentioned that Chen Technologies might be worth investigating for a potential partnership. Richard stood alone in the dining room after everyone had gone, looking at the uneaten food and the crystal glasses still half full of expensive wine. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife number 2. "Saw pictures from your dinner. Looked interesting. Still not interested in grabbing coffee with you, though." Richard deleted the message. 6 months later, Victoria sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's Bentley as they drove through San Francisco toward their wedding preparations. Behind them, their engagement photos were being displayed in Vogue's Power Couples feature. The article had called them, "A Modern Power Couple Redefining Business Success Through Purpose and Innovation." It mentioned Victoria's journey from a marriage focused on accumulation to a partnership focused on meaning. Richard wasn't mentioned by name, but he was clearly referenced as the ex-husband who hadn't understood her vision. Richard, meanwhile, sat in his penthouse office reviewing the same article. His latest relationship had ended 3 months ago. His daughter had informed him she would attend Victoria and Alexander's wedding because she'd become friends with Victoria through social media. The thought of being replaced, of being irrelevant, was almost unbearable. But slowly, something shifted in Richard. He began reading about Alexander's philanthropic initiatives. He started looking at his own business practices, questioning his motivations for the first time in decades. One evening, he reached out to Christopher. "Dad," Christopher said, surprised to hear from him. "What's going on?" "I was thinking about that education project Victoria and Alexander mentioned," Richard said carefully. "The scholarship fund. Do you think they'd consider a donation from me?" There was a pause. Then Christopher said, "Yeah, Dad, I think they would." 2 years later, the office of Hammond and Chen Ventures occupied floors 47 and 48 of a modern San Francisco building. The nameplate reflected an unexpected partnership. Richard Hammond and Alexander Chen had formed a joint venture, combining Richard's investment expertise with Alexander's technological innovation and Victoria's commitment to social impact. Together, they had become the fastest-growing impact investment firm in the country. In the main office, Victoria reviewed applications for their latest funding round. She was now Chief Impact Officer, a role that perfectly suited her. She was 5 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they planned to name Sophie. Richard worked in the adjacent wing of the building. His role was different now, humbler, but more meaningful than anything he'd accomplished alone. He'd had to swallow his ego repeatedly to learn to listen rather than dominate conversations. His relationship with his children had improved dramatically. His son worked in the venture's sustainable technology division. His daughter consulted on their education initiatives. One afternoon, Victoria called Richard into a meeting. Alexander was there as well, along with Derek, Richard's old business partner who joined their firm. "We wanted to tell you something," Victoria said, smiling. "We've been approached about starting a podcast. Business leaders discussing the intersection of success and purpose. We'd like you to be a regular guest," Alexander added. "Your journey from purely profit-driven to purpose-driven investment could be valuable to others." Richard looked at the three people in front of him: his ex-wife, her fiancé, and his old friend. A year ago, the idea would have wounded his pride. Now, it felt like an invitation into something larger than himself. "I'd like that," Richard said simply. The wedding of Victoria and Alexander took place in Amalfi on a perfect spring day. The ceremony overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. 400 guests attended, representing the most influential people in business, technology, and philanthropy. Richard sat in the audience, watching Victoria walk down the aisle. She was breathtaking in her custom Valentino gown. Alexander stood at the altar, tears in his eyes, overcome with emotion at the sight of her. As they exchanged vows, Richard realized he was crying too. Not from jealousy or regret, but from something unexpected, genuine happiness for them. During the reception, Richard found himself at a table with Christopher, his daughter, and several other guests. They were discussing the venture's latest success, a sustainable energy company they'd backed that had just gone public with a valuation of $12 billion. "Dad," his daughter said, "Alexander told me you were the one who suggested that company, that you saw potential in it when everyone else doubted." Richard felt something warm bloom in his chest. Recognition, yes, but more than that. A sense of having contributed to something meaningful. Later, Victoria approached him during the dancing. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for giving this partnership a real chance, for being willing to change." "I should have changed a long time ago," Richard replied, "before you had to leave." Victoria smiled, not with pity, but with genuine forgiveness. "We both got what we needed from that marriage. It just took me leaving to get it." "What did you get?" Richard asked. "The courage to believe in myself when someone important didn't," Victoria said, "and eventually finding someone who always would." She squeezed his arm and returned to Alexander, who pulled her into his arms for the next dance. Richard watched them move across the floor together, perfectly in sync. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, sitting in that restaurant, convinced that success meant proving your worth to others. He'd been so wrong. Over the next 5 years, the Hammond and Chen partnership became the most successful impact investment firm in the world. They'd created thousands of jobs through their portfolio companies. They'd funded innovations in clean energy, education, and healthcare that had transformed entire communities. Richard's role in these successes became known throughout the industry. But more importantly, he'd learned that the greatest success wasn't measured in accolades or wealth. It was measured in relationships. The ones he'd rebuilt with his children, the friendship he'd developed with Alexander, and the professional respect he'd earned from Victoria. The dinner where Richard had tried to humiliate his ex-wife became a story he told often, but with a very different moral. It was the story of how arrogance nearly cost him everything, and how choosing humility and growth had given him a life worth living. Victoria, Alexander, and Richard became an unusual but powerful trio in the business world. Proof that people could change, that relationships could transform, and that true success meant lifting others as you climbed. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful dinner, Richard sat with his old business partner Derek at their favorite restaurant in Manhattan. "You know what's funny?" Derek said, swirling his wine. "Back then I thought you were crazy for inviting Victoria to that dinner. I thought you were going to humiliate her." Richard laughed. "I was going to humiliate her. I failed spectacularly." "Best failure of your life?" Richard raised his glass. "Absolutely. Sometimes the greatest victories come from our greatest defeats. Sometimes the person we try to crush becomes the person who saves us. And sometimes the success we're chasing is actually waiting for us on the other side of humility." Richard had learned all of these lessons the hard way, but that was the only way he knew how to learn.